This book is called Plagues in the Palace, and it is historical fiction that was written by Bradley Booth. Bradley Booth grew up as a missionary, and he spent a lot of time in Bible lands where the stories from the Old Testament actually took place. And this story is about a young man, around 12 or 13 years old, who was alive at the time of the Exodus. He was a Hebrew slave, and this story is written from his perspective of what it might have been like to have been a Hebrew slave in the land of Goshen when the Exodus was taking place. So, Plagues in the Palace, Chapter 1. Meshach stared at the colorful images painted on the walls of the long corridor. Rows of people, animals, and chariots in shades of yellow, red, and topaz splashed their way from one end of the hallway to the other. He just stood with mouth agape at the strangeness of it all. The stone floor felt cool beneath his feet, and all about him stood statues and stone carvings of all kinds. Meshach had never been in this part of the palace before. In fact, at the moment, he wasn't really sure where he was. He was supposed to be delivering refreshments to the royal queen and her guest in the palace, but he must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. Meshach listened carefully to muted voices echoing down the stony corridor. The voices sounded as if they were coming from a large, vaulted chamber nearby. Meshach felt excited that he should be asked to do such an important task. He was tall for his age and strong. He had average looks with bronze skin, almond-brown eyes, and a head of dark hair. But his pleasant smile made people stop and greet him when he walked down the hallways of the palace or when he came into the room. Just recently, Meshach had begun working with his father, Eli, a Hebrew slave in the bakery of the royal kitchens. Eli was a skilled baker, so his services were in great demand. Meshach knew his father was fortunate. Even for a slave, working in a bakery was much better than working on a construction crew building pyramids or temples. It could be hot in the bakery, but it was nothing like working in the broiling desert sun of Egypt. Meshach loved being with his father. His father was a big man with strong hands. Like Meshach, he had dark hair, and like Meshach, he had a smile. Like Meshach, he had a smile that lit up his face when he laughed. Eli was fun-loving and knew how to make work become a game. The two of them always laughed and joked when they were together, and sometimes his father even sang with his deep, rich voice while they worked. And Eli knew how to make the best bread around. The freshly baked bread always smelled so good when Meshach helped his father take the crusty, round loaves from the ovens. Meshach loved to tear off pieces of the hot bread and pop them into his mouth. But although Meshach liked working with his father in the palace kitchens, he didn't get to do it as often as he wanted. Now that Meshach was 13 and no longer considered a boy, his father wanted him to learn how to read and write well. Then he could become a scribe. His mother, Jerusha, was his tutor. Fortunately, she knew how to read and write, and even do some calculations in math. Her father had been a scribe and had taught her well. Meshach knew it was unusual for a woman to have been given the chance to learn. Meshach was a good student. Already he was getting pretty good with the letters he practiced using a wet clay tablet with a writing stick called a stylus. The letters formed words of an ancient language called Hebrew, the name used for Meshach's people. This form of writing had been used by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but since the Hebrews had been in slavery for many generations, very few people could read and write the language anymore. "I don't want my children growing up ignorant," Meshach's father had said many times, more times even than Meshach could remember. "You never know what God may call you to do with these skills someday. We're lucky that your mother can read and write. Many families are not so blessed. He would always smile and ruffle Meshach's hair when he said this, and although Meshach didn't like to study so much, he knew his father was right. Meshach's father could read and write too. He should have been working full-time as a scribe himself, but because he was such an excellent baker, Pharaoh's chief steward himself, Hatshepsut, had insisted that he work in the bakery for the time being. Eli's skills as a scribe also came in handy when Hatshepsut began having him keep the records up to date for all that was bought or sold in the kitchen. Meshach hoped to be a good scribe one day too, but today he didn't have to study. His mother couldn't teach him and his cousin Asher because her sister was having her third baby. Besides caring for her own family, Jerusha also served as a midwife for the Hebrew women in the neighborhood where Meshach lived. It felt good to be free from classes for the day. Meshach was tired of sitting cross-legged on the floor for hours at a time, copying the dark marks his mother wrote on a whitewashed clay brick wall in their home. On days he didn't have to study, he would work with his father in the palace bakery, helping to make breads, cakes, and wafers for the palace meals. Meshach continued wandering through the hallways of the palace, looking for the chamber where Queen Tyee would be entertaining her guest. He'd never been this far inside of the royal palace before, and as he started down another long hallway, those muffled voices he had heard before sounded louder. Meshach walked along carefully as he carried the fresh bread, beer, and platter of melons and pomegranates. Meshach's father had told him to look for Satet, who was chief of the palace servants, who had ordered the afternoon refreshments for the queen and some of her friends. Meshach wrinkled his nose in disgust. Fresh bread tasted good, but he never had liked the warm beer that the royal kitchens brewed in large clay jars. After a while it would get frothy, and if it wasn't used up soon enough, it always developed a musty smell. Everybody drank beer, men, women, and even the children. It was the most common drink in Egypt, but that didn't change the way Meshach felt about it. Suddenly, Meshach caught sight of a small room tucked away at one end of the corridor. In the room was a window opening, and the voices he had been hearing were coming through it. Maybe the queen and her guest were in a chamber on the other side of the window. You'll know you have arrived at Queen Tyee's chambers when you see filmy purple curtains hanging in the doorway, Eli had told him. Her favorite color is purple. Meshach didn't see the purple curtains he had been told to look for. Had he missed some passageway somewhere? His father had been quite specific. You can't miss it. It's 3 corridors down from the large banquet hall with the pictures of sphinxes on the wall. Her chamber doors are the ones with the purple curtains. Meshach had trembled with excitement at the responsibility of serving Queen Tyee. It wasn't every day that a Hebrew boy got to bring refreshments to the wife of the most powerful man in the whole world. Meshach stepped to the small window and peered through it. Is this the chamber where I am supposed to deliver the bread and fruit? He wondered. He nearly swallowed his tongue in surprise. In a large room below him, Meshach could see golden furniture and green plants of every sort. Rich silk curtains of blues and reds gave the chamber a grandeur and elegance beyond anything Meshach had ever seen. Phew! Meshach whistled to himself. Bronze-chested warriors were everywhere. They were tall and silent, and their spearheads and swords glimmered in the light of the sun streaming through small windows high in the white stone walls of the palace. A narrow turquoise carpet with yellow fringes stretched down to the center of the chamber. Meshach's eyes followed the length of it until it ended before a glistening white throne. Whoa now! That's got to be ivory. Meshach had to stop himself from shouting right out loud. This is incredible! A throne overlaid with pure ivory? Wow! I've heard about stuff like this in stories Father has told me, but I never thought I'd get to see it. Meshach's eyes wandered to the high vaulted ceiling, supported by massive stone columns. He marveled at the tremendous size of the columns, and everywhere were chiseled and carved the likenesses of strange creatures, half animal and half man. He could clearly see carvings of Ra, the sun god, with a human body but the head of a falcon. Then there was Apis, the black bull, and Bastet, the cat-headed god. What is this place? Meshach gasped. I must be at one of the royal audience chambers for the pharaoh himself. The fact that he had wandered so near an important room now scared Meshach. What if someone catches me watching from the small window? Will I get in trouble? Will I be dragged off and beaten? Perhaps even put in prison? Meshach's common sense told him he should just find Queen Tai's chambers and deliver the refreshments. But he didn't. Chapter 2. Suddenly, a whirl of activity unfolded below in the magnificent royal chamber. Dancers and acrobats exploded through filmy curtains hanging in doorways between the stone columns. They whirled and twirled their way up the carpeted approach to the throne. Jugglers raced to take their positions, and musicians began playing a haunting melody on flutes and stringed instruments. Moments later, a pompous man entered the chamber and took his place on the ivory throne. He was dressed in linens of the purest white, and a wide collar of beautiful turquoise and gold hung across his shoulders. Its shade of blue-green was as beautiful as the sparkling waters of the great sea. He wore ankle bands and arm bracelets of gold and a black wig beneath a heavily ornamented headpiece. Wow! Meshach caught his breath. This must be Pharaoh Amenhotep himself, ruler of all Egypt. Meshach cringed as he said the words to himself. It hurt to think that his people, the Hebrews, were oppressed slaves in the pagan land of Egypt. How could this have happened to God's chosen people? It was a mystery to Meshach. Do the Hebrews deserve this slavery? Meshach's father had told him that the Hebrew patriarch Jacob had come to Egypt with his children and grandchildren. There had been a worldwide famine at the time, and Egypt was the only place where they could find food. As a gift from Pharaoh, Jacob's family had received some of the very best land in the Nile Delta so they could pasture their flocks of goats, sheep, and cattle. Of course, that had been back when Joseph, Jacob's son, was governor of all of Egypt. That was an amazing story itself. Unfortunately, after Joseph died, a new Pharaoh, who had no respect for Joseph, came to the throne. The new Pharaoh, Thutmose, had claimed he didn't know of the good things Joseph had done for Egypt. He didn't care about the dreams Joseph had accurately interpreted that had saved Egypt from starvation. Joseph was remembered only as a barbarian foreigner from Canaan and inferior to the Egyptians. Or so the story went. It didn't really matter anymore. The Hebrews were slaves in a foreign land now, and there was not much that could change that. Unless, of course, one considered that special promise. Meshach's father had told him many times that one day the Hebrews would all return to the land of Canaan, the land of milk and honey. It was a promise from way back. They would all move to Shechem or Bethel or one of the other places where the patriarch Jacob had originally lived with his 12 sons. Or maybe the Hebrew tribes would move to southern Canaan near Hebron, where Father Abraham had lived for so many years. Of course, there were thousands and thousands of Hebrews now, instead of just the 70 family members that Jacob had brought with him to Egypt more than 400 years before. Now they might fill up the whole land of Canaan. The old man in the Hebrew settlements of Goshen could tell good stories too. One tale that the old men always told around the fires at night was about a cave at Hebron back in the land of Canaan. All of the important ancestors of the family had been buried in that special cave. Father Abraham was buried there with his wife Sarah. His son Isaac and Isaac's wife Rebekah were buried there too. And Leah and Jacob, great-great-great-great-grandfather Jacob, had died in Egypt. But before he died, he had made his sons promise to take him back to Canaan to bury him in that legendary cave. Meshach shivered as he thought about all those skeletons in one place. It made him feel a little creepy. They were his ancestors, though, and he knew they were an important part of his Hebrew heritage. The best parts of his family history had taken place in the land of Canaan. Canaan seemed like a perfect home. That was where the family had lived for generations before they had decided to come to Egypt because of the famine. And even though Meshach had never been to Canaan, it seemed as if he belonged there too. He wished that he could go to Canaan and see all of the sights for himself. In Canaan, everything was supposed to be bigger and better. Meshach had heard that in some places the clusters of grapes grew so big that it took 2 men just to carry them. But were all of these stories true, or were they just tales to be told around the fires at night? Could any place be that perfect? Meshach frowned as he remembered that sometimes the old men also told of other things in Canaan that weren't so nice. Dark, frightening tales of enormous fortresses filled with fierce giants. Surely they were just stories. But whenever Meshach thought about the giants in Canaan, he always shivered with fear. Meshach shook off his fears of giants as he suddenly realized that something was happening in the chambers below him. The Pharaoh was dismissing the performers with a wave of his arm. That was all it took to make the dancers, jugglers, and musicians vanish as quickly as they had arrived. All was still as a court crier announced the arrival of some visiting dignitary. Almost in reply, another procession glided down the carpeted walkway to kneel before the splendid throne. Through it all, Pharaoh Amenhotep remained on his throne, his face expressionless as the visitors knelt before him. A few other important-looking guests came and then went in quick succession. It seemed as if the Pharaoh was not interested in welcoming any of them, or in hearing what it was that they had come to say. "He sure is grumpy," Meshach whispered to himself. "I guess the royal court must be over for the day." But the court crier called out yet again. Meshach continued to stare through the little window. Coming down the approach to the throne were 2 foreigners. "They don't look like anybody special to me," Meshach thought. No important-looking officials walked before them, and there were no colorful robes. The only unique thing about them was their beards and the rather plain clothes that they were wearing. They certainly looked like foreigners. Egyptians didn't wear beards. One was a bit shorter than the other and carried a long shepherd's rod. Meshach couldn't really make out their faces because they marched into the room from under the window where he stood. "What on earth do those men think they're doing in here?" muttered Meshach. "Look at them. They've got to know they're way out of their league, dressed like that. This is the court of the great Pharaoh." Meshach shook his head and grinned. "They won't last a minute before the honored Pharaoh Amenhotep, son of Ra, and ruler over all the land of the Nile." Chapter 3. Far below, on the floor of the royal court, the 2 bearded visitors stood respectfully before Pharaoh. "Not you 2 again," barked an important-looking official standing beside the throne. He appeared to be the Pharaoh's spokesman. The visitor carrying the rod stepped forward and spoke in a voice so resonant that Meshach had no trouble hearing every word he said. "Amenhotep, great Pharaoh of all Egypt, we come before you as ambassadors of the Most High who rules the heaven and earth." The voice of the official began to drone out a response, as Meshach continued staring at the scene in the throne room below him. Could it possibly be? Meshach wondered. Is this the pair of brothers that everyone has heard so much about? Aaron was the speaker, the older of the two. Moses was the famous one. But what were they doing here? Meshach's mind raced back to stories about Moses he had heard around the evening fires. Moses had been born under the oppressive government of Thutmose, the pharaoh ruling Egypt at that time. The court advisors had warned Thutmose that the number of Hebrew slaves was growing too large, that soon there would be more Hebrews in the land of Egypt than Egyptians themselves. Because of this, he had begun ordering a horrible thing: that all the Hebrew baby boys be killed by throwing them into the Nile. He hoped that this would help keep the Hebrew nation from becoming too strong. Not surprisingly, Moses' mother had tried to keep Moses hidden from Pharaoh's death squad of soldiers sent out to execute the babies. She had somehow managed to hide Moses for 3 months, even though the Egyptian soldiers had searched through the Hebrew settlements in Goshen every day. Finally, she made a plan to save little Moses by building a basket out of reeds. She made the basket waterproof so that it would float, and then hid Moses in it among the bulrushes along the riverbank. Meshach smiled when he thought about how successful the plan had been. It had worked so well, in fact, that the baby Moses had been found and rescued from the Nile River by none other than Pharaoh's daughter, Hatshepsut. His basket was drifting along among the reeds when she discovered him. Since she could not have any children of her own, she had then adopted Moses to be raised as her very own son. At first, Hatshepsut had hired Jochebed, Moses' Hebrew mother, to care for Moses and raise him. However, when he was 12 years old, Moses went to live with Hatshepsut in the palace, and with that, he had vanished from the Hebrew settlement into the life of royalty, gone forever from the streets and homes of his people. That had been years ago. Suddenly, Meshach realized that Aaron was speaking to the Pharaoh again, and his words made Meshach tingle with excitement. "This is what Jehovah says to you, Amenhotep. Let my people go, so that they can come apart to worship me." Aaron didn't raise his eyes to look the Pharaoh in the face. The court official looked at the two bearded brothers and smirked. "That's your request?" he snorted. "Yes, most honored one. As before, we come to humbly make our request known to the great Pharaoh." "But you've already heard the Pharaoh's decision. Why come again with the same request?" Meshach peered intently at Pharaoh Amenhotep sitting on his ivory throne. It was almost as if the Pharaoh wanted to ignore the two visitors, and yet, at the same time, he was annoyed by them. Through it all, though, he had said not a word to the two brothers standing before him. Aaron grasped his long rod tightly in his hand. The Creator and Sustainer of all life has spoken, and we can only obey his command. Yes, we've heard all that," snapped the official as he stepped toward Aaron and Moses. "But Pharaoh will not change his mind. He has spoken, and his word is law." "Where are your official papers of authorization?" interrupted a scribe in a nasal tone. Holding a sheet of papyrus on a writing board and a reed pen, he stepped forward from behind Pharaoh's throne. "Your official documents?" he repeated in a businesslike manner, looking first at Aaron and then at Moses. "Before we can go any further, we simply must have proof of your authorization for this visit. What territory or state do you represent, and—" "Stupid!" hissed the court spokesman under his breath. "We already know what we need to know about these two fools." He cleared his throat and continued. "Now,
Since you men have nothing more to say that we don't already know, you may show yourselves out. Your audience with the Pharaoh has ended."
"Please." Aaron took a step forward. "You have not considered the consequences of refusing to let Israel go. Jehovah is not one to be trifled with. When he—"
"Enough!"
The majestic Pharaoh rose from his ivory throne, interrupting Aaron. His patience ended as he stood to his feet and glared at the two visitors.
"I've heard enough. Words mean nothing to me."
His eyes flashed in anger.
"You come here with nothing to represent your God. Not that it would make any difference, but you have no gifts, no royal papers, and you certainly have no respect for me, the great Pharaoh Amenhotep. If you did, you would never come here making such demands."
The ruler's face was stern and his voice was harsh.
"On your knees, faces to the floor," he ordered. "You will reverence me, do you hear? You will give me the worship and respect that is mine." He spat the words out as if they were bitter poison.
Aaron glanced at Moses and then back at the Pharaoh. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty. We worship Jehovah alone. We owe no worship to anyone but him." Amenhotep glared at the two brothers standing before him.
"And I owe no allegiance to this Jehovah God, whoever he is," he roared. "I have never heard of him before, and I don't care to know him now."
Aaron looked at the floor, but Moses refused to give ground to the Pharaoh. He lifted his face with dignity as he stared Pharaoh Amenhotep full in the face. Clutching Aaron's arm, Moses impatiently pushed his brother toward the throne. "Say something," Moses muttered under his breath. It was obvious that Aaron was doing all of the talking, and Meshach wondered why. Aaron glanced at Moses again, hesitated, and then turned to the Pharaoh. "Pharaoh Amenhotep, ruler of all Egypt, if you will not obey the voice of Jehovah, then there is little more for us to say." To Meshach it sounded as if Aaron was giving up, and yet there was the hint of something more to come. "As the Most High God lives, we do have one message for you, so that you and all of Egypt may know that Jehovah has all power in heaven and earth. We bring you this sign." Aaron then lifted his rod in the air and threw it to the floor, where it clattered about on the polished marble surface. Chapter 4.
Meshach jumped back in surprise. To his amazement and everyone's in the courtroom, the rod on the marble floor instantly turned into a poisonous cobra. Its golden scales glinted in the light of the afternoon sun, filtering through the small windows high in the courtroom walls. Its long black tongue darted out of its mouth as it turned this way and that, surveying the room and everyone in it. The room buzzed with excitement as everyone backed away from the serpent. Pharaoh Amenhotep himself stood up and stepped to the side of his throne. His face, however, remained calm and showed no fear. "Did I see what I think I just saw?"
Meshach gasped. He rubbed his eyes and stared down at the courtroom floor. The cobra turned toward the steps of Pharaoh's throne and began to slither slowly up the steps, one by one.
"I must be dreaming," Meshach explained. "The cobra looks real, but it can't be."
He glanced from one side of the courtroom to the other, searching for an explanation of some kind.
"A rod can't become a snake," he muttered. "Wood is wood, and no matter what magic anyone uses, there's just no way that—"
Meshach stopped short. He squinted, and then he scratched his head.
This was some sort of miracle. There was no doubt about that. Had Moses and Aaron used some secret power to make the rod look as if it had become a cobra?
Meshach had heard about the powers of sorcery that the high priest often used. The black arts of magic they practiced were feared by the Egyptians.
But Moses and Aaron were men of God. They wouldn't use the powers of darkness, would they? Moses certainly knew about the magic. After all, he had grown up in the royal palace, where such sorcery was practiced. He had sat at the feet of all the great men of Egypt, and they had no doubt showed him many strange and mysterious things. Many of these teachers were priests in the temples dedicated to the gods that the Egyptians worshipped. They would have seen to it that Moses knew all about Ra, the sun god, and Osiris, god of the Nile. And these priests would have probably tried to teach Moses about other secret arts of Egypt, such as astrology, which was a study of the stars. They would probably have wanted him to learn how to channel the spirits, which was a way of communicating with the spirit world. Meshach frowned. Had Moses gotten mysterious powers from the royal magicians and sorcerers who had been his personal tutors when he was a student in Egypt? Or had he gotten them from Jehovah, the God of the Hebrews? In the name of Jehovah, who is the source of all life, once more we ask that you let Israel go to worship him in peace. Meshach realized that Aaron was speaking again. Amenhotep continued staring at the cobra, but he didn't flinch. Finally, he whispered something to a court scribe standing at his side. Without a word, the scribe turned and left the courtroom. Meshach looked at Moses and Aaron, and then at Pharaoh. Was the standoff over? Had the two brothers won their case? Would Pharaoh let Moses and Aaron take the Hebrew slaves and go and worship Jehovah? Within minutes, Meshach had his answer as a group of temple priests walked into the throne room and past the rows of tall stone columns. The priests' heads were shaved, and they were all bare-chested. Not a hair could be seen on their bodies. Even their eyebrows had been shaved. They dressed in the uniform of all priests. A white linen kilt hung from their waist. One priest wore a golden collar around his neck, and Meshach wondered if he might be the high priest. He looked to be more important than the others. The priest with the golden collar quietly approached Pharaoh Amenhotep, who was now standing behind the throne to one side. Flickering torches had been lit by the palace guards to keep the cobra at a distance, and the flames made little wisps of black smoke curl across the pharaoh's worried face. Pharaoh Amenhotep and the high priest carried on a whispered conversation for a few minutes, and then the high priest returned to his place among the other priests. What will happen next? Meshach wondered. Will the priest kill the poisonous cobra on the steps to the throne? Meshach doubted it. Cobras were considered sacred to Egyptian worship. Will the high priest use his evil enchantments to cast a spell on Moses and Aaron? Will he order the palace guards to take Moses and Aaron away in chains? Meshach realized it was even possible that the two brothers could be executed for daring to defy the Pharaoh. Meshach watched as the high priest stepped forward and held his rod in his outstretched hand. Meshach knew the staff was a type of divining rod. He had seen noblemen carrying them from time to time, and had asked his father how such rods were used. Meshach's father had said the rods were a sign of a man's power and authority in the territory where he ruled. The high priest's rod was more fancy than Aaron's rod. It was made of ivory with silver trimmings on it. Will the high priest use his rod to push or pull the cobra out of the courtroom? Meshach wondered. Will someone get bitten and possibly die? The cobra was very large. It had to be deadly poisonous. But on the other hand, is the cobra real? And if not, is it still dangerous? After all, it had been a rod only moments before. By now, Meshach was so mixed up he didn't know what to think. But if Meshach was surprised at what had already happened, he was in for a bigger surprise. What happened next made the hair on the back of his neck stand straight up. Chapter 5. With a sudden flourish, the high priest dropped his rod to the floor when it rolled around on the marble's shiny surface. And then, one by one, the rest of the priests threw their rods on the floor too. Meshach counted them as they landed on the floor. There were 7 in all. Some were made of gold, others were polished ebony wood with jeweled trim. Each rod represented the rank of the priest in the temple of the god where he served. And then, amazingly, as all the rods hit the floor, they too became serpents. Meshach gasped as they coiled and uncoiled their scaly bodies and then began to slowly advance toward Aaron's cobra, now on the bottom step to Pharaoh's throne. Aaron's serpent was bigger than them all, but it was definitely outnumbered. "Hey," Meshach muttered under his breath, "this isn't fair. 7 to 1 isn't exactly fair odds, and these priests are sorcerers besides. They're using black magic." The 7 serpents had now surrounded the big cobra in the center and fanned out, waiting to see what his next move would be. Suddenly, with a lightning-quick jab, Aaron's cobra lashed out at its nearest attacker. Its deadly fangs sank deep into the neck of the smaller snake as the two of them rolled off the step and onto the smooth, polished floor. They struggled together for a few moments until the smaller one lay limp. Meshach found himself cheering for Aaron's cobra. 1 down and 6 to go. In amazement, Meshach watched as the super serpent attacked and killed each of the smaller serpents. And then something even stranger happened. Aaron's large cobra began to slowly swallow the dead bodies of the smaller serpents. One by one, he ate them, head first, until they were all gone. When it was all over, everyone just stood looking at the large cobra stretched out at the foot of Pharaoh's throne. It was no larger or fatter than before it had eaten the other 7 serpents. Aaron's cobra continued looking this way and that, its black tongue darting in and out as though it were contemplating its next move. Not a whisper could be heard in the courtroom. But when Aaron reached out his hand and seized the cobra by the tail, everyone gasped in terror, and then gasped again in surprise when they saw that the rippling body of the cobra had again become a wooden rod in Aaron's hand. Pharaoh Amenhotep stood brooding over the scene, his shoulders slumping in the late afternoon shadows of the courtroom. He seemed to be struggling to decide what he should do with this demonstration of power. It was obvious that the power in Aaron's rod was much stronger than the magic any of his priests could muster. Moses and Aaron looked at Pharaoh confidently. "Now will you let the slaves go?" Aaron asked. Pharaoh straightened up and shuddered as though he was trying to shake off the memory of what he had just witnessed. He looked at the temple priest and then at his court advisors before turning to Moses. "No, I will not," he scowled. His eyes were cold, and his hooked nose and high cheekbones gave his unsmiling face a defiant look. "Now get out," he ordered, as he returned to his throne and sat down. "I have a country to run." Aaron shrugged his shoulders. "Very well then, we'll go. However, I can promise you that we will return with words of judgment from Jehovah, words that you will not be pleased to hear." Amenhotep stood up from his throne and sternly pointed to the tall doors, standing open at the courtroom entrance. "Leave my presence!" He shouted. Meshach straightened his back. He couldn't believe his ears. "Can you believe that?" he muttered. "Aaron turns a shepherd's rod into a cobra, and Pharaoh says he's unimpressed? Aaron's serpent eats up all of the other serpents, and the Pharaoh tells Moses and Aaron to go home?" Meshach shook his head slowly. The Pharaoh must have lost his mind. As Moses and Aaron turned to go, Meshach suddenly remembered where he was and what he was supposed to be doing. He looked down at the large tray of food sitting on the floor beside him. The bread was no longer warm, and the melons had begun to dry. Worst of all, Meshach still had no idea where Queen Tai's chambers were. As Meshach stepped out into the main corridor, he met a servant girl coming toward him. "Excuse me, could you tell me where Queen Tai is taking her afternoon refreshments?" Meshach felt embarrassed, and he knew his face was turning red, but he had to find the room. He had been keeping the queen and her guest waiting too long already. "Down around the corner and 2 doors to the right," the servant girl replied. "The curtains in the hallway are—" I know, Meshach interrupted. Purple curtains in the doorway. I can't miss 'em, or so I've been told." He turned away quickly and hurried down the corridor. As he turned the corner, he could see the purple curtains ahead. Now he could finally deliver the refreshments. But as Meshach neared the door, Satet stepped out into the corridor, his hands on his hips. And if looks could have killed, Meshach would have been dead on the floor. Okay, Chapter 6. "What have you been doing?" Satet hissed, pointing a bony finger in Meshach's face. Meshach hung his head. What had he been thinking when he stayed so long to watch the Battle of the Serpents? Of course Satet was wondering where Meshach had been, and of course he wasn't happy at being made to wait. After all, he was in charge of all the servants and their duties in the palace estate. I'm sorry," Meshach stammered, his face turning red. "I got lost on the way, and I'll say you did," snapped the middle-aged man. "Probably playing along the way. Boys!" Satet glowered at Meshach. Meshach wondered that Satet hadn't had a major breakdown long before. He was not a strong man. His head was nearly bald and his frail shoulders were stooped. It seemed that nothing could make him smile, and always he was agitated with the things that people did or didn't do. If Meshach hadn't been wondering how he was going to be punished for making Satet wait, he might have had time to feel sorry for the poor man. "I'll deal with you later, young man. You can be sure that your father is going to hear about this," he barked. And Meshach was sure his father would. Satet rarely let a mistake slide. Meshach didn't mind getting punished for a mistake, but he felt sorry for his father. His father's reputation in the royal palace was important, and Meshach didn't want his father to suffer for the mistakes of his careless son. "Yes, Satet," Meshach hesitated. "Is there anything more I can do for you?" "No, I think you've done quite enough. Now get back to the kitchen. Maybe you can stay out of trouble there and get something done for a change." The words stung, but Meshach knew Satet was right. Meshach was probably better suited for work in the kitchen. He was just too easily distracted to be performing duties out and about on the palace estate. Meshach grinned in spite of his mistake. As much as he liked going to the far corners of the palace complex and meeting new people, he liked being with his father more. In the kitchens, Meshach wouldn't have to worry so much about doing the wrong things at the wrong time. His father understood that he was not much more than a boy. As he turned to go, Meshach caught sight of a familiar face down the corridor. It was Seti, an Egyptian boy who also worked in the royal kitchens. Seti made a face and pointed at Meshach. He started laughing, and then he ducked out of sight. Meshach didn't like Seti much. But what could he do about it? Seti was always making fun of Meshach. He was a year older than Meshach, and bigger and stronger too. Seti worked with his mother, helping to make the beer everyone in the palace drank. Maybe that was another reason Meshach didn't like Seti. He always smelled like warm beer. Meshach hoped he didn't have to meet Seti again today. Seti made him nervous because he was always bragging about how superior the Egyptians were compared to the Hebrews. Meshach didn't want to admit it, but in a way, Seti was right. The Egyptians did rule the world, and the Hebrews were their slaves. When Meshach arrived back in the kitchen, his father looked up from the bread dough he was kneading in his stone trough. "Well, my son, I see you finally made it back. You must have found something interesting to do." He winked at Meshach as he threw the ball of dough onto one of the wooden tables, cut it into smaller pieces, and then began shaping the lumps of dough into flat circles. He worked quickly as he placed them on a wooden board, and then slid the board into the clay oven at one end of the long kitchen. Eli's words found their mark, and Meshach hung his head again with embarrassment. "Yes, Father. No. I did find something that distracted me, but I'm late because I lost my way, too." Meshach looked around him at the other workers in the kitchen, and then he lowered his voice. "I couldn't find Queen Tai's chambers, and then I heard voices and discovered a small window overlooking one of the royal courtrooms, and you saw the famous brothers, Aaron and Moses, seeking an audience with Pharaoh Amenhotep?" Meshach's mouth dropped open as he stared at his father. A slight smile played around the corners of Eli's mustache and beard. He stoked the kitchen fires with some lumps of black bitumen pitch, and then paused in his work to take a long drink from a clay jar of water nearby. Eli wiped the water from his mouth with the back of his arm. He usually worked in the kitchen bare-chested and barefoot, and wore only a white loincloth around his hips and thighs. The kitchen was almost always hot, and sweat never stopped running down his face and chest. Meshach continued to stare at his father until Eli's face broke into a smile. "Word travels quickly around here. Most information from the palace passes through the kitchen, son." Meshach looked a little bit disappointed. "Did you already know about how Aaron's rod became a cobra and ate up all of the other serpents in the courtroom that were rods before the priest threw them on the floor?" Meshach stopped to catch his breath. Eli smiled and laid his hand on Meshach's shoulder. "That's all right, son. You were there, and that's more than I can say for myself." "I suppose so." Meshach grew quiet. "But, Father, I don't know what to think. I know what I saw, but I don't understand what it meant." "What do you mean?" Eli leaned against the wall to rest for a moment. "Well, Aaron changed his rod into a serpent, and then all of the priests changed their rods into serpents." Meshach scratched his head. "Did they all use the same power? Were they using the powers of evil? Or maybe was it Jehovah's power?" "That's a good question." Eli handed Meshach a small clay cup of water. "The answer is probably quite simple. I would say both." Meshach took a long drink from the cup. "Both? How could that be?" "Well, Aaron was using the power of Jehovah, and the priests were using the power of the evil one." "But how do we know which was which? All the serpents looked real, and all of them made the hair stand up on the back of my neck." "Meshach, Jehovah would never give that kind of power to pagan priests. The Pharaoh and the priest don't serve Jehovah. They don't even know who he is. They would have to get their power from the dark forces of the Egyptians' black magic." Eli smiled. "On the other hand, why would Aaron and Moses use the power of the evil one? Why should they, when they already have the power of the universe at their fingertips? Eli paused. There were two forces working in that courtroom today, Meshach, and I think it's obvious to you which force won. Eli shook his head and chuckled. What I would have given to see the expressions on the faces of Pharaoh Amenhotep and his group of priests. He lowered his voice as he leaned toward Meshach. Was it good to see the proud Pharaoh humbled? Meshach nodded his head quickly and smiled too. It was good, Father, but the Pharaoh didn't react the way I thought he would. And how did you expect him to react? Well, I guess I thought he would be impressed at the way Aaron's rod changed into a cobra. And, well, I thought Pharaoh would let our people go and worship Jehovah, as Aaron and Moses asked. Eli laughed. Oh, ho, Meshach, I can see that you have much to learn. He lowered his voice again. Pharaoh Amenhotep is a hard man, a cruel and heartless ruler. I know the Egyptians think of him as a god, but we Hebrews see him only as a brutal tyrant. Eli's eyes narrowed to slits, and his voice grew very serious. Nothing is as dear to Pharaoh as having power over others, and I believe he would do anything to keep it, and I mean anything, son. Meshach studied his father's face. He wondered what other stories his father could tell him about the royal court and the Pharaoh who ruled it. Almost in answer to Meshach's thoughts, Eli added, I could tell you things about this man's reign that you would never believe, even if you saw them and heard them for yourself. Eli glanced cautiously around the kitchen at the other workers, though, who were busy with their own task. But it would not be wise to tell you much, he added, and certainly not here. The walls have ears, my son. Meshach laughed right out loud. He could just imagine ears fastened to the walls of the long, narrow kitchen. Ears that heard every word he said, even if he whispered. Chapter 7. Meshach sat cross-legged on the floor of their one-room mud-brick home. It was time for the evening meal. As the meal was being prepared, he watched the small charcoal oven make weird shadows on the wall. The meal had been set in the center of a woven rug made of goat's hair. It felt soft under Meshach's feet. A large clay pot of pottage sat in the center of the rug, and a platter of flat, round bread sat beside it. Meshach licked his lips at the smell of savory lentils, garlic, and fresh bread. Meshach's mother, Jerusha, was the best cook around. As was the custom, she and Kezia would serve the men and the boys first, and then eat later, separately from the men. However, they all raised their eyes together toward heaven for the evening's blessings. That was a custom they all took part in, even if men and women did eat separately. Meshach loved his family. His mother looked young for her age, but Meshach knew she worked too hard. Besides caring for her family, she was also midwife. Often she stayed out all night caring for the women who were giving birth. Chilion, Meshach's younger brother, was 10 and smaller than many boys his age. He was quiet and serious, and there wasn't a day that passed when he wasn't bringing something interesting home to study. Sometimes it was a leaf or a strange rock. Sometimes it was a locust. One day he even brought home a small wooden contraption he had made that could fly. It had flat strips of wood that stuck out straight on either side, and when he tossed it into the air, it floated for quite a distance. And then there was Kezia, Meshach's older sister. Like her mother, she was pretty with long dark hair. Meshach knew it wouldn't be long before young men in the Hebrew settlement would be asking for her hand in marriage. She was only 15, but already she could do everything that the grown women could do. Meshach was proud to be a part of this family, but he wondered how long things would stay as they were. He had a strange feeling in the pit of his stomach that somehow, very soon, something was about to change. Now that Moses had come back, Meshach was sure their whole world was about to be turned upside down. Meshach dipped a piece of bread into the large pot of lentils and garlic, and then looked at his father. "Tell me more about Moses, Father." Eli glanced at Meshach before taking a drink of water from the clay cup at his side. Moses. Now that's a man with an interesting story, son." Meshach sat up straighter. "Father, now that Moses has returned to Egypt, I was hoping that you might know more about where he's been all these years. I mean, he did disappear for a long time. What was he doing?" "Good question," Eli nodded with a twinkle in his eye. "That's the problem," Meshach replied eagerly. "I've got so many questions, but I feel like I'm not supposed to ask them. I mean, it's as if Moses is carrying a big secret with him, and now, after what happened at the court today, he seems even more mysterious to me." Eli put his hand on Meshach's shoulder. "I couldn't agree with you more, son." He paused and looked at Meshach. "You're becoming a man, so we can talk plainly. It's true now that Moses has returned, we have more information than we've had in years. You see, no one knew much for the longest time, not even his family. He just disappeared into thin air, it seemed." Eli paused and looked toward the open doorway. "You never know who might be listening, Meshach. I'm sure Pharaoh Amenhotep has spies living here in Goshen among us. Some of the spies are probably even Hebrews. I think that here at home we're fairly safe, though." Meshach's father rubbed his full belly comfortably and sighed. He leaned back against the rough brick wall and watched the wisps of smoke curling upward from the embers of the charcoal oven that had cooked their supper. "Moses was educated by the best that Egypt had to offer," Eli began. "He was given every opportunity under the direction of the master scribe, who was in charge of all of the tutors for the children in the royal family. Ditu was his name, and they say he was a genius. According to all the accounts I've heard, he immediately saw the potential in the young boy Moses. Moses was only 12 when he moved into the palace, but already Ditu could see his potential greatness. And Moses did do well, so well in fact that it soon became obvious that he might need other teachers more skilled in the subjects of trigonometry, hieroglyphics, and government affairs. He also became skilled in the latest of weapons and warfare. They say that as Moses grew older, there wasn't a man in Pharaoh's personal guard or the special forces of his army who could beat Moses or outwit him. Not with a javelin, a sword, or a bow, and no one could ride better than Moses." Eli smiled. Not surprisingly, he eventually became a general in the Pharaoh's army. And, as expected, he became a successful military leader. He fought in the battles of Upper Egypt near the border of Cush, and also up north in the land of Canaan. And when he always came home victorious, there were parades in the streets of all the royal cities of Egypt. Everywhere people celebrated Moses, the military genius, had come home. Eli paused to stretch his legs. By now, Moses was the most famous man in all the land of Egypt, and the most popular. He was a favorite at court, and his adopted mother, Queen Hatshepsut, was pushing for him to become the next pharaoh. This was exciting news for all of the Hebrews. It fit in perfectly with the prophecies among our people that said a deliverer would come someday and free us from slavery. Eli turned and winked at Meshach. And of course, many were convinced that Moses might be the one. After all, he was himself a Hebrew. Meshach squirmed with excitement as every part of the story unfolded. He could hardly make himself sit still to listen. For years, Jehovah has sent his messengers among us, Eli continued. We call them the seers, and they have prophesied deliverance for our people. Wow! Meshach's eyes were bright. You mean deliverance through someone like Moses? That's right. And then good times can begin again, and we can all go down to Canaan? Well, yes, but of course there are some things that we have been told we must do too, as Jehovah's people. Eli took another drink of water from his clay cup. According to the seers, we must be faithful to our heritage. As far back as great-great-great-grandfather Joseph, we have been urged to be true to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Faithful? Meshach asked. In what ways, Father? Faithful to keep Jehovah's holy Sabbath day, and not to worship the idols of Egypt. We are to worship only the one true God, and we are supposed to eat only certain animals. Much of what the Egyptians eat is not fit for the human body, you know. Eli sighed, and his shoulders slumped a little in the gathering darkness. It's hard for our people, living among pagans in a foreign land. I'm afraid that many of the Hebrews have been unfaithful in obeying God's commands. Meshach looked puzzled. I don't get it, he said. I know our people haven't always been faithful in everything, but after all, they are slaves. I mean, why didn't Moses just rise up and set the slaves free when he had a chance? If he had done that, then the Hebrews could have left Egypt and we could have all been in Canaan by now, being faithful to Jehovah and doing all the things he wants us to do. Good point, son. Good point. Eli smiled at Meshach's impatience. That's the next part of the story. Eli tousled Meshach's dark head of hair. Of course, as you know, Moses didn't set the slaves free. Something did happen, though, that changed things for Moses here in Egypt. It happened one afternoon as he was making rounds in his chariot. He was on an inspection tour of the building sites, and he saw an overseer beating a slave. The slave was a small man, and he was huddled on the ground begging for mercy. It didn't seem to matter to the Egyptian overseer, though. They're a mean bunch, you know. Anyway, in spite of the poor slave's cries, the overseer continued to beat him again and again with a whip. Eli paused and raised his eyebrows. Now remember, Moses was a Hebrew by birth, no matter where he grew up. So you can imagine how he must have felt as he witnessed the slave being beaten. I know how I'd feel, Meshach chimed in. Me too, Eli nodded. I don't think I could just stand by and watch. Anyway, as the story goes, Moses was so upset at seeing the slaves being beaten that he jumped down from his chariot and grabbed the whip from the overseer. Really? Meshach's eyes grew big. That's right. And then there was a struggle between the two of them. The two of them began to fight? Moses and the overseer? Meshach couldn't believe his ears. That's right, Eli chuckled. Now, overseers are typically quite strong. The government usually picks big men to manage the slaves. They've got to be tough. But of course, Moses was strong too. In fact, because of Moses' great strength, he overpowered the overseer, and he actually ended up killing him. Meshach couldn't believe his ears. Moses, the great man of God, was a murderer? Meshach had never imagined that such a thing could be. Was it possible? Were there other things from Moses' past that would surprise people? Were there other secrets waiting to be discovered? Chapter 8. Meshach stared at his father. Moses killed the overseer? I I never heard that part before. Lots of people haven't, Eli added. The story is a couple of generations old now. Maybe people think the whole thing is just a folk tale. Who can say? Anyway, it did happen. And it was a terrible tragedy. At first, no one in the royal household would believe it, because Moses hid the body in the sand. But eventually word got out. You know how bad news gets out. It always finds a way. Eli grew solemn as he told this part. I think one of the reasons it shocked everyone so much was that no one expected it. Moses was such a favorite in the royal court, and among the common people too. But Father, Meshach's voice grew softer. Wasn't Moses just trying to help the poor slave? He shouldn't have killed the overseer, but he was part of the royal family. He could do what he wanted, couldn't he? And the Hebrews would at least be glad, wouldn't they? After all, he was helping one of them. You would think so, Eli replied. But you've got to remember that no one really knew who he was anymore. Most doubted that they could trust someone who had lived in the palace his whole life. Meshach frowned. This doesn't make sense, Father. I mean, didn't our people see what he was trying to do? Meshach shook his head in wonder. This was their chance. The Hebrew slaves could have risen up and overthrown the Egyptians. Why didn't they? There were enough of them. They could have if they'd wanted to, couldn't they? They could have, maybe. What do you mean, maybe? There are more of us than there are Egyptians. Well, it's true, we are many, but we aren't trained to fight. We don't have the weapons, and we would probably lack the courage and the discipline to fight a real war. And that's what it would take. Eli raised his finger. However, I have my own ideas about why things went the way they did. You do? Meshach looked at his father in surprise. Eli nodded his head. You see, I think Moses was beginning to realize that maybe he was the one who was supposed to deliver his people. Eli paused. But I also think it might not have been Jehovah's time for him to do the job. God's ways are not always our ways, you know. I've heard that one before. Meshach shook his head in disbelief. But it's sad. Our people could have been free by now. It seems like such a terrible waste. It does, doesn't it? Eli sighed. It's sad. Not many people talk about it anymore. Maybe they want to forget what was and what could have been. Anyway, somehow or other the story has grown old. Hardly anyone speaks of it now. Eli's voice wavered. Meshach thought about the things his father had told him as he watched the faint shadows from the charcoal oven dance across his father's face. But Father, Meshach kept on, I don't understand. Wasn't Moses the son of the queen? Wasn't he the crown prince? Couldn't he have just freed the slaves if he wanted? I mean, he was going to be the next Pharaoh. It would seem like that, wouldn't it? Eli nodded. It's true, there was no male heir to the throne. All of the pharaohs at that time had no boys, only girls. Moses probably did seem like the logical one to be the next pharaoh. Eli straightened his legs to stretch them again. But, son, you must understand, there were many in Pharaoh's court who were not happy that Moses, a Hebrew, was allowed to enjoy such a high place in the family of the Pharaoh. If it hadn't been for the queen, the priest of Egypt would have seen to it that Moses would never be ruler in Egypt. In fact, there were many just waiting for him to make a mistake so that they could get rid of him. And now, of course, he had made a mistake, a huge one. So what happened next? Well, Moses knew exactly what he had to do now. From that point on, he would be considered an enemy to the throne. His very life would be in danger if he remained in Egypt. Meshach took a deep breath. So he ran away? Exactly. Now, until recently, no one really knew what had happened or where Moses had gone. He just disappeared. Some thought that maybe he was killed by an angry relative. Others thought that Pharaoh had him executed for the murder, but that was later proven to be just a rumor. Many guessed that he must have gone into exile, but no one knew for sure. It was as if he had just vanished into thin air. Meshach's face grew sad. So I guess, along with the disappearance of Moses, went everyone's hopes of a deliverer. That's right, son. And he's been gone all these years. It must be some 40 years now at least. Meshach looked around the small room at the other family members. Chilean and Kezia had now fallen asleep on the rug, and Mother was dozing too. Only the sound of a few dogs barking in the streets broke the evening's stillness. The little fire in the charcoal oven had nearly burned itself out now. Meshach tossed enough fuel on the coals to keep it burning until morning. He turned to his father once more. 40 years! That's a long time, Father. And now, he suddenly just shows up? What's he been doing all these years? I mean, where was he all this time? Well, for the last several years, we've been hearing stories from the east, rumors about a desert chieftain living among the shepherds of Midian. Traveling merchants spoke of him as a great warlord, not so much because of the battles he won, but because of the way he brought peace to the tribes where he lived. Meshach smiled. And you think the warlord was Moses? I know he was, Eli answered with a smile. So now this warlord shows up demanding that Pharaoh let our people go? Eli nodded. It looks like it. But that doesn't mean that Pharaoh will just listen. He frowned and then sighed again. The next few months are not going to be easy for us. Meshach's face grew serious. What do you mean, Father? If our people are set free, won't that be a good thing? Of course it will be. But you don't think Pharaoh's going to just let the slaves go without a struggle, do you? Meshach yawned and then closed his tired eyes. He hadn't thought of that. He just knew that there were a lot more Hebrews than Egyptians. Lots more. Some said there were hundreds of thousands more. Meshach stared at the coals of fire, now barely flickering. Father, you know so much about Moses. I've never heard most of the stories you told me here tonight. Where did you hear them? Eli smiled again in the darkness. Well, son, I guess I do have somewhat of an edge on the rest of you. You see, I have been spending time at Cousin Nadab's house for the last several days. Aaron has been there several times, and I have had a chance to talk with him personally about all of this. We're all from the tribe of Levi. Eli nodded as he nudged Meshach. You and I, Nadab and his brothers, and of course Aaron and Moses. Wow, was all Meshach could say. It was too much information for a tired boy to handle. Later, Meshach lay on his reed mat looking up at the stars. Often he slept outside on the rooftop of their mud brick home. It was cooler up there. Thousands of Hebrew families lived just like Meshach's family did, in one-room dwellings on the outskirts of Tanis in Lower Egypt. Tanis was a royal city, and it was also where many Hebrew slaves worked, building storehouses, temples, and monuments for the Pharaoh. Meshach liked looking up at the night stars. It made him feel close to nature and to Jehovah. Looking at all those stars made him feel small, but it also gave him a sense of peace. It made him feel good that the same God who had created all those stars had also created him, a Hebrew boy, in a nation of slaves in the land of Goshen. Meshach wasn't sure just what Jehovah would do next, but things were getting pretty exciting. Were Moses and Aaron on the verge of doing something really great? Could Jehovah still use Moses these many years later after he had been exiled for murder? Would the two brothers be the ones to finally lead a revolt of the Hebrews and bring an end to their slavery? Could they really pull it off with cruel Pharaoh Amenhotep on the throne? Meshach could only wonder how this would all come about. Was there something the Hebrew slaves needed to be doing first? Was deliverance going to come when the Hebrews began to live good lives and obey Jehovah's commands? That didn't really seem likely. Meshach was glad to be living in a family where Jehovah was loved and obeyed, but not many Hebrew families knew much about Father Abraham's one true God anymore. A warm wind blew in off of the desert from the east as Meshach finally closed his eyes. He tingled with excitement as he remembered the events of this day. Jehovah, the God of the universe, was about to do big things for his people, and Moses had arrived in Egypt to be a part of it. Meshach could feel it in his bones, and he wanted to be there when it all happened. It was the most exciting feeling he